Hey, so thank you for coming. This panel will be recorded. You can find it later on YouTube if you want to rewind and watch some of the interesting things that we are discussing today. The panel is organized by Neo Protocol. We are building a layer 1 protocol out of San Francisco. We have a pretty strong engineering team that built kind of distributed computing and distributed storage in the past. And for the past 7-8 weeks, me personally, I was talking to a lot of gaming studios, understanding the requirements and what's important for the space. So for me, it was very interesting to actually bring some of the best projects in this tiny space today, but some of the best projects to talk about the plans for the next couple years. What would it take to get to the mass market, actually, as well as understand kind of like how people think about ideal customer, how to get to your goals. And so we'll start with introductions and talk a little bit about each project. So we'll start with Devin.
Should I use this or?
We'll actually pass this one.
Okay. So my name is Devin Finzer. I am with OpenSea, which is a marketplace for crypto assets, primarily in the gaming space on Ethereum right now. So we allow users to buy and sell things like CryptoKitties or God's Unchained cards, or other crypto assets, and some of them are even outside of gaming right now, but gaming has been a big focus for us.
Hi, I'm Mickey Maher with Dapper Labs. Dapper Labs is creator of CryptoKitties. Dapper Labs has also launched the first smart contract wallet in the space. Launched that on Monday. It's called Dapper. And then there's going to be a big announcement soon of another game. Probably going to release it this Friday, so stay tuned for that.
How do I get on the invite list?
You're not already?
I'm not.
I'll put you on it.
Marguerite DeCourcelle, founder CEO of Blockade Games. We've built a blockchain platform to support a free-to-play game called, so our main title is Neon District, and it is a Final Fantasy-inspired cyberpunk RPG. Been working on it for about 2 years. And really excited about this space and working with all you guys.
Thank you. Hi, I'm James Ferguson from Fuel Games. We build AAA games on the blockchain, and our most popular game is called God's Unchained, which is a TCG that runs on Ethereum.
Hi, my name is Roessner. I'm with Arcade Distillery, co-founder and CEO, and we are a proper console game developer. We are launching normally our games on PlayStation, Nintendo Switch, Xbox, and we have last year announced the first console-based blockchain-supported video game coming out soon.
Maybe we can start from there, so it's easier. We don't need to. So I was wondering, maybe like on a more personal note, how did you start with the space? How did you get interested in the blockchain aspect of it?
Interesting enough, so we started the whole project around blockchain by actually getting hired to build a game for blockchain. So, coming from the console space, being my whole team, all video game designers, all video game developers. So that was our focus all along. And we got hired to do our first kind of like test run on the blockchain and build what they considered a proper game for blockchain, which we started. And through that process, really learned a lot about, obviously, technology around blockchain, smart contracts, the whole concept of ownership and decentralization. And yeah, that's how it all started. Should I just move this over? There we go.
Cool. My brother and I have been very interested and involved with Bitcoin originally, and then when Ethereum came out, it was essentially quite groundbreaking to be able to have that level of customizability and control that level of logic in a decentralized and trustless manner. And we got very, very excited by the potential of Ethereum. This was sort of quite a few years ago now, and it took us a while to move. We were both developers, but to move into the blockchain space full time as Ethereum sort of became capable of hosting these sorts of real applications on it. And it's still going through that phase now, and a lot of other blockchains are having a look at the same space about how you can move from having real applications to being able to host enterprise grade and consumer-sized products on the blockchain. We got really interested when ERC 721 came out. Essentially, the idea that non-fungible tokens could be used on the blockchain allows it to be opened up to so much more than everyone's mindset was just ERC20s and trying to work out a way to bring utility through that way. My brother and I are very, very avid gamers, especially in our past, especially in highly competitive esports style games like League of Legends, Hearthstone, etc. And to us, it seemed like the next logical step was to raise money and try and build sort of a game which people would play anyway, even if it had nothing to do with the blockchain, and just use the blockchain as sort of the invisible infrastructure which backs that experience.
So my background was primarily art, fine art, and then creative technology, and I was a gamer. So when script mining happened in 2013, I was ready to go and started mining Litecoin early on. Then I started thinking about, this was around the time Ready Player One, the book, was really, had come out. And it made me think about like how virtual currency and like gamers get virtual currency. That's just in our blood. And so for me, my understanding of Bitcoin and crypto and how that all made sense, and like, oh my gosh, it's not trapped in an application. You can take this and transfer it for world value. And then I tied into my art background of hiding private keys and turning it into pattern making, into physical artwork, digital artwork, turned into treasure hunts on the internet. Had a lot of fun with that for about 6 years. Was eventually hired as a consultant for building communities. I got really tired, actually, though, of relaunching projects over and over and over again and rebuilding communities from scratch. So I turned around, launched Blockade Games beginning of 2018 with my core team that had been with me that whole time and wanted to do Neon District. And the cyberpunk theme is just so perfect for crypto, right? If you've been in this space, like it's so very excited, I guess, about where we go from here. Love the idea of ownership, like you guys are talking about, non-fungible tokens. These are all things that gamers have always wanted. So.
Thanks. So I guess I'll come from it in two different perspectives because I'm not a founder of the company. I joined later. So personally, I was interested in Bitcoin, invested in Bitcoin. Promise that's not on my LinkedIn page. I actually bought some kitties in the past. And I spent the last 12 to 13 years in gaming. So when I saw CryptoKitties launch and I bought the kitties, I started thinking about it and then realizing that a couple of people behind it were people I knew or friends of mine. So we started talking and it just made sense that my background in gaming, my interest in the blockchain kind of come together and joining a game company. The story of CryptoKitties and why the company started it and was interested in it was there's a company, a venture studio in Vancouver called Axiom Zen. Axiom Zen has built many award-winning consumer-facing products or apps. And really what they try to do is they take new technologies and see if we can use our creativity and our UX, UI designers to build amazing products using these technologies. So CEO went to a group of 5 or 6 one day and said, hey, let's see if we can build something for the consumer blockchain. And really the first thing that came out of it, and the idea that came out of it was CryptoKitties. The idea wasn't necessarily well received internally. It just didn't seem like something that would necessarily move the needle, but the people that came up with it, the group of 5 or 6, were really passionate about it and really behind it. We launched it, and the rest is history. So we've really unlocked, we think, the potential in the blockchain gaming space, and we see just from some of our consumer behavior, some new behaviors that this space has unlocked, desires of the customers, the engagement level of the customers. So we're going to double, triple down on that and continue to build games for the blockchain, what is now through Dapper Labs.
So my background is consumer tech. I worked at Pinterest for a while after I graduated. And CryptoKitties, I think, was kind of the magic moment for my co-founder and me. We were interested peripherally in Bitcoin and Ethereum, but kind of turned off by the lack of really like mainstream consumer-facing apps, just because that was kind of what we were interested in building. So this idea, I think when we first started looking at CryptoKitties, the really interesting thing about it was the fact that you could permissionlessly build applications on top of it. So shortly after CryptoKitties launched, there was Kitty Race, which allowed you to race your CryptoKitties, and there was Kitty Hats, which allowed you to accessorize your CryptoKitties. And so that kind of, from there, it kind of emerged like, what were the other sorts of applications that might scale horizontally across the new assets that are coming online? And one of those kind of obvious ideas at the time was building a generic marketplace. So that's, our background isn't in gaming, so rather than go and build a game, we figured let's build something that will be useful for games and also have like a consumer side to it.
Cool. And now we'll switch to some project-related questions. Kind of like for your business, what would be the most important thing that you're targeting as a metric of success? What does success look like, and as well as what's your plans in relation to that for next year or two?
Yeah, for a marketplace specifically, our kind of top level metric is GMV, so gross merchandise volume. So we're looking at that. I mean, we look at everything, but you know, everyone knows there's not that many users in the DApp space right now. So what's impressive is that these items are being valued at much higher levels than you'd see in traditional games, and often are exchanged at like ridiculously high prices, right? We saw that with CryptoKitties. Part of that was a little bit of speculative mania, but I think we're also starting to see the effects of true ownership really take root in these early communities. So for us, rather than, I mean, we of course look at DAUs and MAUs, but we're also really looking at like how much value is exchanged in these markets. And that's, I think the exciting thing there is that that has been growing pretty substantially in the last 6 months especially. We've grown our GMV roughly 50 to 70% every month just based on this kind of early market of blockchain games.
I would say that, well, first of all, our whole company mission is to bring 1 billion users to the blockchain. Billion is not an exact number, but bring a lot more than there is now, right? So we see 2 avenues to do that. One is through content, so we're building games. But another avenue or another thing that needs to be unlocked is the technology side of it. We crash Ethereum, as I'm sure everyone in this room knows. There's a lot of friction, a lot of confusion on onboarding just your normal non-technical user today. It's very costly to play games in terms of gas fees and other things. So there's just a lot of friction in the technology. So we're looking at it as more of a step-by-step process of how do we take what we've built, learn from it, iterate, and then build something that attracts 5x, 10x, 100x more users than the previous thing did. And the 2 avenues to do that is better, more in-depth content and less friction, technology with less friction and more scalability, right? So as those things improve, and with the launch of our Dapper wallet, we're trying to improve some of that ourselves, but with better content, not only from our team and our studio, but the space as a whole. I'm really hoping that other developers in the space build more in-depth, more robust, more rich game experiences, because I think that's good for everyone in the space. And it validates the space, but just what we're looking at is just improving upon what CryptoKitties is from both a content perspective and a technology perspective.
So basically, I'd say a couple of metrics is players can come, they have a username, password, on board, and they're playing, right? They're playing the game. There's no, the friction, we've abstracted away the bad user experience that we associate with blockchain products. We did a tech demo, proved out the tech stack, saw this happen, had 44% next day retention with users. They loved playing and collecting these assets, and then built a gateway so these users can take these assets from their layer 2 game, take it to the OpenSea actually, and sell their assets for their first Ethereum potentially. That was super cool to see happen in the wild, like we did that. So took that same tech stack, that is what's underneath Neon District. But Neon District game design can support the idea of creating value through gameplay. So doing that and actually accomplishing that for me, it will be a giant success. But in addition to that, the 1 million monthly active users, because once we do that, we have, blockchain games are good to go, right? Then we get to that billion. Right now, there's the load is still struggles under certain circumstances. But we're going to get there. We have 1,000 highly qualified beta users for Neon District that we're going to be working closely with over the next few months before we ramp up to our Season 1 release in Q3 to stress test the network and get it ready for mainstream gamers. And I guess in addition to that, the virals, how many, designing the games to socially, gifting for free, for example, on Layer 2. I can airdrop my assets to my friends and they can get it in their email or a text message or on their social media and access a game account. The account has been formed for them. All they have to do is claim it. Those social, how many users can you bring? You bring 5 people. That's how your game goes hockey stick.
It sounds like we're all having very similar sort of North Stars, which is how do you get 1 million people on board onto the blockchain and then 1 billion people after that. And so we've been exploring this concept in a couple of ways. We've had a couple of great things about the infrastructure around that and also about the user acquisition side. So virality obviously works really well. I suppose I can touch on a couple of other things which we're having a look at from the user engagement side, because that's one of the other big benefits of blockchain games, is that you sort of get this crazy retention that happens when people have some level of skin in the game. So what we've been building out, and we're quite excited by, is we've been building out a decentralized governance system, which is based on the sort of liquid value of the sum of your non-fungible tokens, as well as how engaged you are in the game. And then based on that, you get to control the meta destiny of the game itself, which works really well when you have sort of a game which has been designed for esports and also designed for different seasons and competitions. So in future games of Gods Unchained, we have one of the things we've been doubling down on is influences and having a really big world tournament. So our tournament pool prize is about $500,000 US for the first year. Eventually, there will be some Gods Unchained cards which are imbalanced as we continue to produce more content. One of the nice things about the blockchain is not just that you get to make guarantees about scarcity and immutability, but it is that you get to involve the player as the designer and as the people who control the destiny of the game itself. And that's something we're really excited is how when you engage that layer as well, you get to have retention in games that previously, there are games who have tried to do this, EVE Online. It's a very basic game. It's essentially a spreadsheet model against each other with, fancy visuals, but their player base is so obsessed with this game because they get to write the meta story and the meta narrative of how this game plays out. When you start moving from just an experience which you're selling to allow real value to be in these worlds, this experience becomes so much more engaging. And we're really excited by that on top of, obviously, mainstream adoption.
Yeah, so we are the newbies in that space, right? So we come from the console side, and I have to take with that the metrics that we know, so definitely also users, downloads, and it will be very interesting. We want to take a different approach to the whole space as well. Obviously, we are storytellers, we are content creators, and we are looking at the space when we are launching our games between 80 to 150,000 downloads in the first months normally. So we are, aiming high, and we are also following the free-to-play model. So incorporating blockchain on a later stage where we believe we can get as many people on the game as possible, as fast as possible, adopting the game and incentivizing them then to take it one notch further and up to upload and connect to the blockchain and bring their assets there. And then obviously, we can all work together to bring it all up to 1 billion users. And but yeah, so those are the metrics that we're looking at, and at the same time also in-game average in-game time, which normally in our games is between 60 and 90 minutes. So that's obviously a big thing for us, how we evaluate the quality of our content and adding content over time.
Cool. Maybe we can also touch a little on behaviors. Maybe you see some new behaviors emerging, being fan-owned games, like investing directly games or trading digital assets between gamers or between games or something else? Do you see anything else that's emerging that's a brand new behavior?
Yeah, I can not really say a lot to that from our own experience, but what I definitely see is, you mentioned the Ready Player One model, the whole idea of having a one inventory that jumps across all the different games and platforms. The big part, what we were focusing on, the game that we are developing right now, which is Plague Hunters, is a proof of concept basically. So it's not really about that game; it's about the software that we developed in the back end, and we are focusing also on software tools that we want to develop for other indie game developers to make it easier for them to bring their games to blockchain, connect them to console, connect them to other games, and creating an environment really where we all can trade assets between games, between platforms. So agnostic to everything there.
I think it's really interesting that you brought up interoperability, because that's one of the cool things about the blockchain space. If you conform to a spec and that spec is open and the data is also open, then people can build on top of what you've built, whether this is essentially without your permission. So we have about 10 sort of fan applications and sites around Gods Unchained of varying quality, some sort of quite basic, some extremely, extremely good, which you would sort of get if you hired 3 or 4 devs at $100,000 plus a year, which is really cool to see, the community being involved in that way. But then there's also things you can do at the studio level. So something we did with Dapper and CryptoKitties was we did an interoperability promotion where if you have a cat or a kitty in CryptoKitties, then your beautiful 2D kitty turns into a 3D version of the exact same kitty in Gods Unchained that you get to show off to your opponent on the side of the board. So it's something that you can essentially bring something. Yeah, very intimidating. It's something where you can show something you're quite proud of, these people who are some of the original owners of the CryptoKitties, or they have their favorite ones, and then they can bring it across into this new context.
Similarly, actually, so we recently did a founder sale for our game. We sold the game boss for season 0, and it was actually purchased by a game developer, someone that is from the game industry, right? Not blockchain game industry, like the game industry. They're working with 3 other blockchain companies right now, so that when that token moves into their game, it takes on the IP of the asset, which we have to figure out, right, as a company. But that's really exciting because now we're not financing this development. This is now being financed by an owner of the asset who's proud of it and wants it to also increase in value. So that's exciting, but also the community, that sense of co-ownership we see. So when we're talking about player behavior, everybody that now has skin in the game is actually ready to, just like, so we've seen this in the fungible token space, right? Like in the different communities, that people, when they own this asset, they're ready to go rally and cheerlead on social media for whatever favorite cryptocurrency people have. It's not any different in the game space. And not only that, but they want to see the game succeed, so they're very supportive. I would say something that stands out though is the average user spend for crypto games is 10 times higher than the industry average. And that's because of that sense of co-ownership. And I think that is incredibly disruptive for the entire space, the gaming space in general. And maybe you guys have seen higher numbers than that, but that's something that we've seen. So that's exciting because people are owning these assets that they can hand down hopefully over a generation. And you can be bonded with these characters and have invested in them and developed them, and they become a sense of legacy that we haven't seen before.
So you asked, well, first of all, some of what I was going to say was already said, so I won't belabor the point too much, but I'll kind of frame it a different way. So you asked about metrics in the previous question, and the reason I didn't bring up traditional game metrics is because I think some of that will be redefined within this new space. Like MAU and DAU for us is really misleading just because of the nature of the game. And I also think engagement can be redefined somewhat from what we've seen. So I'll touch on interoperability and as a form of engagement, right? So interoperability and then something else. We call this like the engagement we see with our users is more like a joint venture where they're fully incentivized, fully engaged in the entire experience. So one part of that. And one thing that we saw happen was when we first launched the game, we didn't have really the necessary bodies or expertise to support a game per se. So you had all these discussion channels that would open, with users discussing the game, talking with each other. They all needed moderators. So what happened was, in traditional games, you hire community managers, and they would moderate these different channels, Reddit, Discord, whatever. Our users took it upon themselves to go out and moderate channels and assign, themselves the moderator of each individual channel, just to ensure the success of the game and to make sure the users were happy and getting their questions answered, because they were incentivized to do it. And then the interoperability piece in terms of engagement is, we saw what we call the Kittyverse pop up out of nowhere. And essentially, Kittyverse is, it's now about 50 apps, but it's basically third-party apps that were built on top of the CryptoKitties smart contracts. And really how that came to be and what happened was, our users just wanted more to do with their kitties. So they started building experiences where you could dress up your kitties, race your kitties, so on and so forth. So there's 50 different experiences that our user base went out and built themselves. And what's interesting, and I think what's even the most important thing about what we're doing with blockchain gaming is this interoperability aspect to it. Because what it did was this unlocked the creativity of our user base to go out and do other things that made the kitties valuable and interesting. But if you do this at scale and you build a more in-depth experience with millions of users, you're unlocking the creativity of a development community that can build all kinds of different experiences on top of your smart contracts. And that's very interesting. And it's also interesting for the users and developers because it's a riskless thing. So when Facebook opened their platform to gaming, they owned the rules. They could do anything they wanted. So what they slowly started to do was change the rules that game developers built their businesses on top of, ruined a bunch of businesses, and eventually kept changing the rules. Businesses kept going out of business, kept failing because the rules changed, and eventually they shut down that entire platform. And that's what makes the blockchain different because it's a riskless endeavor. Developers, as long as the smart contracts are open, developers can build on top of that with immutable rules and feel free to build these experiences and make revenue out of these experiences without us being able to take it away or changing the rules on them.
Yeah, I would echo most of what's already been said. I think two interesting trends we've seen from the marketplace side have been, number one, lowering of the barriers to entry for investors in games. So we're seeing a lot of folks who maybe sort of care what the gameplay is, but are more interested in it from a sort of investment perspective. And usually these are folks who are very crypto curious as well. So they're they bought into this vision of a world of non-fungible tokens. But I think that group of folks could expand, and having open marketplaces that exist outside of the game really allows these people to participate in a way that doesn't require necessarily learning all the details of the game, but still providing market-making functions and liquidity to the game. So I think that's really cool to see. The second area, to expand a little bit on the interoperability side, I think right now is a really exciting time for small developers because they can build very high leverage products. So an example of this is there's a developer who's building something called CryptoVoxels. And CryptoVoxels is it's just one developer, it's this virtual world, and you can basically own a piece of land in this virtual world and build sort of a Minecraft type building inside of it. And what's really cool is you can also show all of your NFTs inside of your virtual world. So he's just gone from basically an isolated virtual world to one where your CryptoKitties can show up, your Gods Unchained cards can show up, you can buy those items in the world, and he didn't have to have a relationship with any of those original games, and now he scaled his virtual world to thousands of different experiences. And so we've been really impressed with games that are able to bootstrap off of existing communities. I think we'll see a lot more experimentation from developers in things like NFT airdrops, things like adding value to existing communities in like a really meaningful way. And then the other interesting thing about the space is just the overlap between the users and the developers. There's a lot of users right now who are highly technical and can deploy smart contracts and often are incentivized to do so because, as James said, they have skin in the game. So.
Yep, and maybe we can also touch briefly on geography. Maybe you're seeing some trends where a particular area gets more engagement today. That's one question. And another question, what outside of usability, scalability that we mentioned here, all of you guys mentioned, what else can we do as an industry to get to millions of people?
So on the geography side, we have seen a lot of Japanese users. So right now, the top crypto game by transaction volume is a Japanese game called My Crypto Heroes. It's a little ambiguous how much of that volume is real, how much of it is botted. But there's certainly, in terms of visitation on our site, there's a lot of activity in Asia. We don't have the most insight on that. And then in terms of areas where I think the space could work together to improve things, I think interoperability and open standards is something that kind of emerges naturally as things progress, but I think that's one area where events like this, meeting of minds, places where you can talk about how to make these interoperability right now is great, but it's still really hard to do at the end of the day. And I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done, but is happening on just making those developer experiences better. And then the obvious ones are kind of improved user experience, blockchain scalability, those sorts of things. But
I'll second the Japan answer, but I'll elaborate from what we've seen. If you know anything about the Japanese culture, it's not heavily English speaking. They don't necessarily engage in non-localized products, but we saw one of our highest or largest audience, highest spending audiences in Japan, and we weren't even localized in Japanese, which was literally amazing, was mind-blowing. So the Japanese market is prime and mature for this space. And then your exact second question was what? I'm sorry.
Outside of usability, scalability, what can we do to push the mass adoption?
Yeah, and any gaming medium or any gaming platform, discoverability becomes a huge issue and a huge hot topic, and there's nothing really being done in this space right now for discoverability. It's just apps that exist on the web somewhere, right? There's a couple of centralized places where you can discover things, but I don't know if it's a problem that needs to be solved today, because I don't think there's enough users in totality in the space yet where someone can funnel users from one game to another at a scale that matters. But at some point, I already see the discoverability of these games as an issue. So someone will eventually solve that.
So actually, this is a pretty surprising metric, but 90% of our users are from the US as for the RPG, which is, I think it's mostly driven by social media, such as Twitter and those other crypto networks that we have. But we have partners, so partners in Korea and Japan. So for the RPG, we're really going to push that distribution. But I guess for that next million, I really believe in the social gaming, the fact that you can gift people digital assets across any social network, and you can customize it, and it's almost like sending an email, but in an art form that you can trade. And I think that is actually something brand new that, while we brush it off, maybe no one's going to care. Actually, I think people are really that's going to be super sentimental. Send your boyfriend or you can invite someone to prom by this game item that they can actually then go play with in a game. I think that's really cool.
Yeah, I second that. That is good.
Checks the boxes for the boyfriend also.
In terms of geography, I think we're seeing similar stuff all around. So for us, it's US, Japan, China, Korea are the big four. I think in terms of something which would be really useful to help the space take off based on our own experiences is a good identity solution. So currently, when you're having a look at metrics or you're having a look at different dresses, or you're trying to give items, if you want to give something to lots of people, if you wanted to do an NFT airdrop, it's impossible to be able to not game them. So whether they're DAU metrics, whether you're doing a giveaway, there's no real way in a decentralized manner currently to be able to verify that this is one person and they only have this one account. And if you could get around that, then I think a lot of these creative ideas that a lot of people have about how to increase growth would be more feasible than they currently are, where you need to start thinking about how people will game the system, because when there is value involved, people will game the system.
Yeah, same on the locations, definitely US and Japan here for the Asian market. And well, I have to say, for increasing or getting more people onto the system is really great content. The more great content we get out there, the more great fans and evangelists we will get, and the community grows around that. If we take it too technical, then this will remain a too technical topic. The content is really, from our experience or from our perspective, what drives engagement and what brings the people to the user base. And also, how do you think about the planning? Do you have like long-term kind of pipeline of games, or do you focus on like what you have at hand right now? So like, how do you think about it? Yeah, so we approach every game, or I should say, most of our game concepts we approach with a universe approach, right? So we have a universe in mind where next titles, upgrades, additions to titles existing, they're all part of one big universe, where obviously the interchangeability and so forth comes into play as well. But that's just from the content creation standpoint, that's the go-to place where we start and where we go and where our path leads us. And I think that's that has always been our motto, and I think that's the majority of in the game space. That's what you see. It's really remaining in that universe and then having your pipeline around that. And then you might branch out into sub-universes and so forth, and then we get all lost. But then that's kind of like the idea of it. And then there's Avengers Endgame.
Most of the content and the stuff which we're building out is currently around Gods Unchained. So I suppose we have the main Gods Unchained experience, which is the TCG itself, but then we also have are in the middle of setting up and doing all the deals to set up a massive esports scene around that, which is just as much work as building the game itself, and then building out the decentralized governance model of using NFTs, which no one's been able to do yet. So all the content we are currently doing is in order to double down on Gods Unchained.
Was there a question? Did you ask another question?
Yeah. How do you think about not just one project, but like how do you think about the whole pipeline of projects? So for you, like how do you think about Plasma Bears versus Neon District versus other things?
Yeah. So I do believe in the power of the franchise. Definitely. If you think about Star Wars, it exists. Like they can launch Han Solo, they can have Rogue One, and these stories are very powerful within the Star Wars franchise. But so that's why we are very almost generic in the cyberpunk landscape that we've developed. It's almost like a Blade Runner versus Aliens crossover feature. And that's purposely done because there's so many stories we can create, and experiences, side stories, quests. But then these assets, when they transfer, for example, if you brought a Plasma Bears into Neon District, it would not be a Plasma Bear. It would be something like a robotic evil bear robot attack buddy, right? That we have crafted for our storyline. And same with if we had any partnerships. But I guess the content creation, I really think that, so we've done this high level, okay, we can do games in blockchain. Like we can do cookie clickers. We know that works. So now it's a matter of creating a powerful story, beautiful art, really drawing the connection to art and game assets, because art and games have been the story that actually the fine art world has blown over for decades. And I'm actually really excited to see what that looks like when we recognize that games and fine art are actually, like, you can monetize that and capture it, and these artists can get paid with a long tail revenue model. Third-party content creators can now actually make a living. These indie game developers we're all talking about that actually have had a really hard time tapping into communities. We're gonna have an incredibly defensible, self-sustaining community that develops. That feature is very powerful.
Yeah, so we have a full game studio at this point. We've been able to get some people from the likes of Zynga, EA, Hasbro, EU Online. So we've got some game talent, and we've got a full pipeline of games over the next 18 months. I think I mentioned one we'll announce this week, but we're using our game studio to build new games, build new experiences, as well as CryptoKitties is such an important tentpole for us. It's such an important game with a very important audience. So we're balancing CryptoKitties specific initiatives versus new games within our game studio. But we've got some cool ideas and some learnings from CryptoKitties, and games are hard. We talk about this. Games are a hit-driven business, so just because you have one hit doesn't mean you'll have another. You have to invest and launch a few, and if you take your learnings and you apply some methodology to it, you should be successful, but it's no guarantee. But we have a full list of games or games ideas that we'll be launching over the next 18 months, including stuff that is within the CryptoKitties realm.
We don't really have games.
But how do you think about onboarding new games onto the marketplace?
Oh, okay. So we try to make it really easy to onboard new games to our marketplace. So to get your assets appearing and tradable on OpenSea is a 1 to 2 hour process if you're ERC 721 compliant. Actually, even shorter often. So that's really important for us. I think in the spirit and just from a sort of scalability of our company perspective, it's really important that anyone should be able to create an instant marketplace. And then we definitely have bigger companies that we don't do a lot of outbound outreach to game companies, but we do have bigger players that are interested in working with us more directly on building sort of customized, white labeled marketplaces or more embedded experiences. And we're pretty much open to anyone who wants to work with us, even the really small indie players. And I think I'm even more excited about some of the indie players because they're really in this position where they can be very lean and creative with what they're doing versus a big company like Fortnite that has to answer to making a lot of money off their existing user base. So.
Yep. And I guess next question related to this would be, do you see a lot of interest from larger game studios in space, or not really? Because it's quite a change in perspective. There's certain loss of control that's happening, right? You talked a little bit, Mickey, about open platforms, right? Versus how things were done before. So I was wondering, what do you see?
Yeah, so from our vantage point, and again, not an expert on sort of the evolution of gaming, but I think blockchain does represent a platform shift that is somewhat analogous to previous platform shifts. So one of those was the shift to mobile. The other shift was the introduction of free-to-play games, so games where you don't have to necessarily purchase the game up front, but you could buy upgrades later on. And in all of those scenarios, I guess Canvas games is another example. Facebook Canvas games gave birth to Zynga, right? So in all those scenarios, I think the general trend was the first movers were the smaller game studios that were not wedded to the previous business model. And I would characterize this shift as essentially the movement from a centrally controlled economy to an open economy, right? So a existing game might look a lot like a sort of ecosystem within itself that is very hard to break out of, and a blockchain game looks like a much larger, more complex ecosystem. So I think smaller companies are more well suited to experiment in that space and figure out what sorts of business models and games really make sense, and then the bigger companies will be the ones that follow. In terms of what we've seen, we've definitely seen interest from larger players, but it's still sort of dipping their foot in it as opposed to, or at least from our sense, as opposed to diving really deep into it. And I think that's kind of to be expected with any big platform shift.
Yeah, you stole my answer somewhat, but I'll expand on it. I'm sitting up here with a lot of white hair. That just means I've been around and seen a lot of things. So I started in the gaming space in around 2007. And at that time, if anyone knows, Facebook opened their platform to apps, quickly became a games platform, and specifically a free-to-play games platform. The first real free-to-play games or gained popularity on the Facebook platform, Zynga. So I saw it in Facebook. Multiple billion-dollar companies, Zynga leading the way, Playdom, Playfish, et cetera, built businesses on top of a new technology, a new platform, while all the AAA gaming incumbents, larger gaming companies stood by the side to watch what happened, and then they had to overpay later to either get into a mature space or buy companies that participated in that space early. Now, that one's obvious, but I think what a lot of people don't realize is the iPhone. Like, if you think about the iPhone, how obvious that is as a gaming platform, but mobile gaming was also made by indies, started by folks like Halfbrick out of Australia, Rovio. They were the first movers. Then you had Supercell, King, Machine Zone, etc. Again, a new platform, an obvious gaming platform, but the big guys didn't get into it late. And frankly, mobile gaming created multiple billion-dollar companies that were acquired by the likes of EA, Activision, Disney, etc. It's the same thing here. Big game companies aren't going to invest in the space because there's guaranteed ROI. There's money to be made on the spaces they understand and they're currently investing in, right? So Glue, EA, Activision aren't going to take development resources from console or mobile to experiment into this space until there's millions and millions of users in it, or there's a lot more money to be made than we're currently making now as a space. So as long as us on this panel, us in this room do our jobs, and hopefully many others that start building on the blockchain, if we do our jobs, the larger incumbent gaming companies will follow and follow pretty quickly once we prove it out.
So I'd say that, my game company, we have, for example, our two game designers came from the game space. They worked with Richard Garfield, with Magic the Gathering, Artifact, and some of these other major titles. Then our game producer was at 10 years at Disney, and they're working with Blockade at startup rates, right? They're doing this because they're excited and they love it and they see the vision. In addition to that, the person that bought the Game Boss, he came from the game space, and like the Neopets creator is the owner of one of our God Keys, which is one of our top 20 assets. The developers are very excited. So when you talk about these game companies, you're talking about the business people that don't want to get involved in the risk taking. The game developers from the mainstream game space are super pumped, and they're going to be they are so excited to play. So I think that is something that it's just going to be a network effect, because the builders are going to build it, and then everything else will happen.
Yeah, I don't have that much to add on that. I would definitely notice the same thing with the developers. A lot of game designers, game devs hate free-to-play, even though free-to-play makes lots of money, because essentially you're trying to work out how to extract as much attention and money out of your audience as possible, rather than creating a truly fun and deep experience. Maybe something which is interesting is whether legislation, which is starting to come into play potentially against a lot of the free-to-play practices, which is being looked at around the world, might be able to be some force either for or against adoption in blockchain games. So things like every single day there's uproar about whether kids are spending too much time on Fortnite, or whether battle passes are too addictive, and whether loot crates are too addictive, etc. Whether something this is a catalyst in some form could be quite interesting, but otherwise I used to agree with all the same thoughts that we've heard.
Yeah, I just want to definitely support your thought here that we as the indies, we break the rules. We are the ones that disrupt. So it's always coming from below. And but all the conversations that we had in our space with bigger game studios, everybody's looking at it, obviously. Everybody's taking a look at it, is observing it, and it's like, when should we do it? And then, but they're waiting, they're milking their cows, and they will send out Royalty will send out their sheriffs of Nottingham in form of loot boxes until they can't anymore and give it then to the people. So it will happen. They all see that's the future, but they will keep on their milk cows, hold on to their milk cows as long as they can.
And also maybe we can double click on delicate balance between gameplays and like really compelling stories and gameplays and this kind of new concept, because blockchain brings to the table more like on economic side of things, on a little bit new behaviors, but then also the games have to be compelling, right? What we saw in the past couple of years were a lot of transactional games in blockchain space, like gambling, Ponzi schemes, that kind of stuff. So I was wondering, how do we balance the compelling gameplays together with this new technology?
Yeah, it goes back to many things that we said before. I think obviously content, as I said before, is one of the key elements where we need to offer the people good games to play. And with that, I mean, the actually groundbreaking new thing here, as we all know, is that you can own the assets. You can build on them, you own them, you maybe give them to the future generations. And then you have a whole environment that you built yourself. So that whole concept of ownership isn't entirely new in the proper gaming space, and that's the disruptive part. And now we just balance that, as you said. I mean, if we balance that with a proper content story, great content to play with, everything will be beautiful.
Yeah, I suppose the way we're thinking about it is you need to build a game which people would play anyway. And if you can get that part down pat, then blockchain allows you to explore new ways of lowering CAC, so customer acquisition cost, and new ways of sort of increasing customer engagement. So this is through people wanting to share their content, they become advocates for the content. There's cool things which are starting to be explored by some people around the idea of user-generated content and being able to, like, content creation on the game side is one of our massive costs. We've spent God knows how much on art at this point, just to be able to support our game. If you can outsource that to users and give those users a cut of that money by allowing them to be a participant in the space, then that's something that A, increases engagement, B, decreases acquisition costs, and C, allows something which was previously like a really big cost for the business to now turn into a zero.
I'd say with those transactional games that you're referring to, that's somewhat of a punishing user experience. So interacting with the game actually cost users money to do it. A lot of times they didn't have something more valuable at the end of the day. It was based on however the game was designed. So I think that what we have the opportunity to do is really reward players in a way they've never actually been rewarded, this financial sense of reward or value creation that we can now have through these games, which is, by the way, incredibly hard to do. Designing for open markets and open economies with the game design is like something that the game space has been fighting, like trying to figure out for decades, really. So the fact that we are going to just embrace open markets and just take it head on, I think is, it's an opportunity to see like how creative we can get, because games can you can break a game economy very easily. So you have to build in those buffers. Basically. But so once you have this rewarding experience, it doesn't cost you anything to create the value, and you can walk away and have something valuable because of the time you put into it. That is a whole new area to be explored, and that reward that players will have. I mean, now their sense of gratitude towards the game company, I think, is something where they feel part of it. So yeah.
Content is king. That's it.
I would. I think what we're seeing is a similar trend where game developers are obviously focusing on the game first and the asset management is one component of it. The content is king kind of idea. The only thing I would add to that is I think there is another path, and these sorts of experiences look a lot. Maybe they're not exactly games, but they are virtual worlds with value exchanged inside of them. So I think the great example is Decentraland, where they haven't really built a game yet. They're, in theory, building a platform where people can build games inside of it. But at the same time, it could be an interesting place where people hang out and do things. And because you can own the land, they already have one of the biggest NFT markets, just based on pure speculation for the value of this economy. You can imagine taking loans off of your land. You could imagine all sorts of financial things that you might do inside of this world And it's hard to say whether at the end of the day that's a game or sort of a miniature economy with real property rights. So I think that's like another exciting avenue, is just the sort of very crypto native path that feels a lot like, sort of where Bitcoin was when it was first starting out. But I think all of those fronts will lead to progress in the space.
And we'll take some questions from the audience as well.
I was really excited to see that PayPal and eBay are going to be selling collectibles. And I wanted to ask Devin what he thought about that.
I don't know anything about it. I just saw the sign at Consensus. I think, for us, sort of, it's a little ominous, I suppose, but it's also exciting because it does bring legitimacy to the collectible space. I think the idea of having a big market, for these things and increasing exposure to them is awesome at the end of the day. I think eBay, I think we may see a similar sort of trend where it becomes difficult for incumbents to adopt full like blockchain native applications where, for example, with OpenSea, you could imagine one day there might be user ownership of the marketplace through something like a token. And I think those sorts of big leaps will be a little more difficult for big players. So I don't really know.
Any other questions?
I have a question for Dapper Labs. Of course, you guys were, in a way, groundbreaker in cryptocurrency-based games. But one of the biggest downsides, users saw that the value that CryptoKitties accumulated over time. Of course, you hear about the stories that some of them were sold for thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars. But then the barrier, kind of going back to that barrier to entry component of things, how do you, for example, someone hearing about CryptoKitties in 2019, where a lot of users who have been in CryptoKitties space from the beginning, and they don't have the financial stability to say, I can't drop $30, $40 for a Gen 1 CryptoKitty or Gen 0 CryptoKitty. How do you stop that manipulation happening in the market, and especially for people, like say you have a game coming out on Friday, how do you stop those individuals for buying in all the assets in a way and then manipulating future users in that space?
So just so everyone heard the question, question is how, like in CryptoKitties, a lot of users bought up the assets and now the assets are expensive, and how do we prevent that from happening in CryptoKitties or in future games? Is that? Yeah. Well, I would say the first part of your question is, what are you trying to get out of CryptoKitties? Because there's a number of, thousands, tens of thousands of cats in the marketplace for less than $2, right? So the experience is meant to be a game, and you can get into the game for a couple bucks and breed and play the game for that, right? So if you're trying to buy, it's just kind of like, it's a market, right? So the early kitties, the more exclusive or rare kitties are worth more. And that, they got bought by early adopters. It doesn't mean that, it wasn't, some of it became a financial speculation tool, but it's not really the intent of it. The intent is to be a game. So I think really what we can do is just make fun, creative, interesting experiences that people like playing. Some people will have more valuable assets, others might not, but it shouldn't affect necessarily the balance of competitive nature of the game, whether or not you have the $100,000 CryptoKitty or the $2 CryptoKitty. It's more of a personal user investment, and the price should never prevent people from playing the games. And I don't feel like that is the case in CryptoKitties. Yeah, there are some outrageously priced CryptoKitties, but in any game economy, there are people that spend, people spend $100,000 on CryptoKitties in free-to-play gaming. There's people that spend $10 million a year in some of these games. So, it's just creating an experience in a game where the user that spends the most money doesn't necessarily get an advantage in the game. Does that help answer?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Any more questions?
Yeah, I was wondering what are the main technical challenges involved in building the blockchain game, and what are potential solutions that you'd like to see to that end to encourage prototyping or make that faster, iterate ideas faster? It's an open-ended question.
Yeah.
One of the big issues that we had to deal with is just how gas heavy the original and some of the following implementations of ERC 721 are. And we've had a couple of proposals where you can lose a little bit of fungibility and gain a lot in terms of gas, but that doesn't necessarily work for our use case either. We ended up spending lots and lots of time and developer effort in redoing something which is compliant with ERC 721 just to get it to that stage where it doesn't clog the network like crazy. So I think we've sold over 4 million cards now and we haven't had any of those crazy spikes. But if anyone can build whatever they want. If someone does an F-coin style spam like they did last year, or if people build on basic versions of ERC 721 and are playing with the gas price and your game is too dependent on the gas price, then that's a massive factor that's not even within your control in sometimes. So I suppose scalability is the number one. I think that everyone up on this panel is 100% serious when they have a reasonable plan to get millions of users onto the blockchain. So we need to make sure that we do it in a manner that doesn't ruin the blockchain for everyone, while also being able to invest the R&D and hopefully, well, we all know that the layer 1 protocols are doing that as well themselves, but making sure that everything is built in a scalable way for when these millions of users come, because they will.
To that point, when we started our founder sale, so the first top 20 people had access to the sale, 17 people were participating, and we were taking up 50% of every Ethereum block, right? And that's like 17 people. So if you could imagine lots of games happening, even on layer 2, but settling on layer 1, it doesn't take a lot to clog the network. So yeah, there's a lot of work to be done there. I'd say for us, development-wise, there's a lot of work that's involved, especially if you have tokens that are evolving through gameplay. So that requires your art pipeline and your production pipeline, your game development pipeline, and the networking, and the wallets, and how that engineering piece. That took us a year to really figure out. And then also the content creation that you need is constant. So every season we have, so we're releasing in season 0, season 1, season 2. That is so much work. I think that if you're not a game developer, you really just don't understand how much work that is. Anybody else?
Yeah, definitely scalability. One big part that we've seen also in the development here is that we haven't really settled on the decision on what blockchain we want to build our game and release it in. And so there is so much happening all the time. There's so much happening all the time. So there is, to make a decision here, an informed decision is sometimes really hard. And as we mentioned before, I mean, the lack of standards is also something that's a pain, right? So coming from a pretty standardized standardized environment from the gaming space there, going into this little wild world there are a couple of just bumps that you hit on the road, and you try and also to build something that is now popping up left and right, third-party tools, so to speak, that are helping us also getting something on the road which would also be playable across multiple blockchains. So things like that are coming up, and you're following the trends and seeing what's happening and what you can use. And I think we achieved the biggest goal of all, for us all here in the gaming-ish space, that we, when we come to the point where we're not talking about the blockchain anymore, but we're just talking about the games and their work. So you're not talking about the engine, you're just driving your car. That's the goal from our perspective.
I wanted to add that, so on our layer 2, we have custom contracts. They're completely custom to our game, native to our game, all of our needs that we have. But then when these assets move to mainnet, any mainnet, so anything EVM compatible, basically, we can support. Those assets are minted on those mainnet networks. in a standard that makes sense, so that if somebody wanted to take something into Gods Unchained, it would be, development-wise, we can all figure that out. But that's potential. Like you on the layer 2 solution, you can have all kinds of fun smart contracts that are really complex and fun and unique for your game, but those don't have to be interoperable with these other games.
Any more questions?
Hi. So you just touched upon, you guys talked about interoperability and user-created content. And also, I think you mentioned like a Robin Hood reference about how very large publishers and big players in the industry throwing their weight around are kind of, their reputation is in the toilet. EA is not really doing so good with loot boxes, and they've triggered a lot of interesting legislation to either moderate that or stuff like that. I guess one thing that I wanted to narrow that down is gaming marketplaces. You have Valve, they have Steam. Discord just opened Nitro. Epic Games has opened their own marketplace. You have a lot of people, a lot of already very large companies, and some of them on the up and coming, opening their own back-end platforms, either as a point of sale or just, they even incorporate tools for content creation. Do you think that, or as, owners of companies yourselves who've had to make deals, have you been approached by any of these entities, or do you think that they would play a really integral part in working this new approach to blockchain in development? Like, I guess you could say it's hard for me. Do you think that they will come together, or either of their own power, or Near or another back-end protocol will be brought up or approach them, and they'll come up with a way to really kickstart blockchain in independent game development?
Should I repeat the question, or was it loud enough for everyone? Yeah, okay. I think we kind of touched on this here. I think that's the eventuality. Large game companies will come into this space and leverage the blockchain for their platforms. But the companies you mentioned, Valve, Steam, Epic, I can't remember the third one, but nonetheless, they're all doing fine. What they're doing is printing money. They're not going to look at what we're doing. They're looking at it. They're saying, oh, this is interesting. But they're not going to dive in. They're not going to care about it until, what I want to say, it's too late. Meaning it's too late for them to get in cheaply. So the Valves and the Epics of blockchain hopefully will be made in this room. And then we'll compete with them on some level. We'll become part of them. Some of us might become part of those companies. Who knows? But those companies are printing money, and they're not going to do anything this experimental until the users frankly demand it, right? So once the users flock into only blockchain experiences, and they start bleeding users because what we're doing is more compelling than what they're doing, that's when they'll start really paying attention.
And I think I touched on this very briefly in the beginning. So and I totally agree with you, by the way. So the Unities of this world in the beginning, right, when they started, it's the indies that disrupt, right, that break the rules, that create something that other people need or want to do. And so with that, for our own games, we designed the tool that we needed to build something for console. And we want to make this available to other developers as well. So it comes really from the grassroots movement there. And obviously it makes sense then to partner with Unity or an Unreal to have a plugin for that tool to work with other developers that are using those tools already, and just enriching and enlarge the environment that is already existing. And that is the same for Valve, for all the platforms that will open up for our games as well as the moment comes that the users demand it.
I was just going to add, for context as well, the amounts of money that the Valves of the world make through Steam, they're making $4.2 billion in primary sales, and that again on downloadable content. So $8 billion in the blockchain gaming space is nowhere near there, right? It's probably 100 million or something at this point per year. It's also quite interesting. I definitely think that they will come into the space eventually. Their business model is based on the downloading and the distribution of the executable, which is where, when you're in a rent-based business where players are renting short-term entertainment off you, that's very important. As things are shifting into free-to-play and then into free-to-play with an economy, maybe something like an OpenSea becomes more important than as a source of discoverability or something than the actual downloading of the executable ever was.
Did you? She had a hand up first.
So one of the value proposition for blockchain is a censorship resistant, right? So for the whole gaming space, as long as this token is, no matter it's marketplace or it's like content related token, as long as it's publicly traded on any major exchanges like Binance or stuff, so it will become like an individual, like what is it? Like a national reserve currency at some point. It will become an individual economy, right? And then, do you think this is the biggest opportunity to unlock the? Maybe they're at the end of the day they'll have a bunch of companies like Ready Player One, and then that's the biggest, because as you guys said before, there's like lower cost of user acquisition, lower cost of user retention through the user-generated content, and then in that case, there's another issue about it is what is going to be the monetary policy. What's the most healthy way to keep that economy running when you have like multi-hundred millions of users are able to access that game? Maybe ideas like Ready Player One, right? So what will be the best like approach to create a healthy economy? We know that companies like EVE Online has been done well, and the Apollo 30 has been failed because of the auction house wasn't really healthy. So I think all of you guys have an idea of like creating that like universal game currency. So what is the best economic approach?
Well, first of all, I would be thrilled if God's Unchained cards became the national reserve currency.
They're not? They were in Australia.
Coming soon.
That's why God is in gold, right?
Exactly. The new gold standard. I think that what's really interesting is when you have a look at blockchain games, something which is really interesting is separating, maybe there will be some sort of popular digital currency itself. I think that there's a lot of companies who are bigger than everyone here who are trying to work out how you bring governance to that layer when you have a fungible token, especially when you're running your own protocols. I think what we're finding is really interesting is something that games have on that side, even that politics doesn't, is that people care more about our games than they do about the upcoming election. So people are more passionate about God's Unchained than we've got an election happening in Australia this weekend. And the level of sort of passion and craziness that you see from some of the users compared to, federal politics is just on a different level. So you get really fast iteration times as well. An election is something that only happens once every 4 years or so. A game can be updated every week or even faster than that. So you have this really interesting bed in which you can try to explore some of these ideas around governance and what that looks like when it's not just based on fungible coins, which have their own issues, fraud on the minority, etc. How do you incentivize good behavior and discourage bad behavior? But also trying to explore what that looks like in a world where there's more value than just coins. So it could be through experimenting forms of liquid democracy where you can transfer your votes to other people, and then you can be rewarded with either gameplay experiences or more value. So it can be, unique cards. If you vote on which cards should be banned from the upcoming world tournament next year, would be a good example. And then your votes can be calculated based on the aggregate value of all your NFTs. And you can use different formulas like quadratic voting in order to minimize things like fraud on the minority. But at the end of the day, these are sort of technical solutions where what we have is a philosophical answer, which is that you can give more power to the player and the users. And when you do that, you can increase their fan levels, you can increase their engagement. By giving them a little bit more, you can start knocking down players who are bigger than yourselves and moving yourself up the popularity list. So it's more profitable for you as a studio, it's more popular and profitable for the players, and everyone's getting a little bit more.
So like we have purposely avoided having any fungible token in our game at all, because with how that can fluctuate, it can really break people's investments and how they've invested into the game. So you can have in-game currency, but you funnel that into your assets, into your gameplay, and then you can remove the assets themselves and trade them from real-world monetary value. So we're not really focused on having any sort of settlement layer solutions. We just want to like have people to walk away with assets that reflect their time and value. But in addition to that, I had a really fun conversation with Himmler Vilgar from CCG, who's the CEO for EVE Online, and I was chatting with him about this. They've created this economy, right? It's not based on blockchain, but they have a real world economy. Something they battle with is botting. And what they've done is they are flagging people that they suspect are botting so that other players in the nearby area can come and take care of them. And then when they take care of them, they get all the assets that are dropped. And so it's like bounty hunting, like taking the creativity, using, leveraging your gamers and allowing them to solve these problems, which is something that all of us have to think about when I think you guys also mentioned that like real world economies and asset and value creation is a problem. So we have to be creative in how we're going to take care of those problems.
Yeah, on our end, for Layer 1 protocol, we also thought a lot about economics. We talked to all of the top economists in the country, basically University of Chicago, Columbia, Stanford, MIT, and nobody is up to speed in this space. So people kind of still catching up with like Bitcoin, Ethereum, kind of like 5 years behind. So we had to basically figure everything out in-house. So to answer your question, as it relates to general economics of the space, it's not figured out. Yep.
So do you see a possible scenario where something like Tencent, the largest game company in the world by revenue, by a distant, like EA is a distant number 2, which has investments in Bluehole, now Crofton, to Epic, to Riot Games, to Supercell, which is also developing a blockchain, which has probably the largest, basically, digital payment system in China, decide to put their game assets in their portfolios and offer them a blockchain solution. I mean, how likely do you think that possibility is?
Next to zero until the users demand it, because it's too disruptive to their current business, and why would those companies who name, there's nothing in that sentence that needs to be disrupted.
There's actually a Tencent game which is on blockchain.
Yeah,
launched a month ago.
I'm sure they're experimenting, but are they going to put Clash of the Clans or any? No, it's next to zero that they do that. And even if they did put a game on the blockchain, I'm sure it's like dipping their toe in where it's not really what we're talking about in terms of blockchain gaming. So until, again, my answer, until the users flock to our experiences or games in the tens of millions, none of those companies will disrupt their current business or users introducing something like this.
It's most likely they'll just acquire blockchain game companies from the West anyway.
Yeah, sure. See, that's what happens that's what's happened on every platform that I know of since 2007, that they let the indies or the upstarts figure out the new technology and they come and acquire it. I mean, King, biggest success on mobile, what Activision acquired him for $10 billion? I can't remember the number, it was like $8 to $10 billion. So yeah, sure, maybe. But that's what happens. They'll keep an eye on it, they'll experiment, they'll learn about it, and then once it's worth paying attention to, they'll probably acquire into it. Anyone else?
No, great.
My question is sort of an extension to what you were saying. What is your take, everybody in general, about monetary exploitation versus ludology when it comes to blockchain-based games? Eventually, when we get there. right? Players who are exploiting games for monetary gains versus the actual knowledgeable player set games.
What's esports? Esports people are professionally playing games for money. I can see blockchain gaming unlocking anyone being able to play games for money. So your 12-year-old sitting in the basement playing Fortnite all night, he's not that great. He's not going to get a live stream. He's not going to get a sponsor. But if there were NFTs and items that he could be earning while playing, he's spending his time more valuable now, right? More valuably. So I actually, if I understand your question correctly, I think it's a good thing. I mean, not the exploitation part, but I don't see it as exploitation. It's exploitation as much as these professional gamers are live streaming their games to make money. That's not exploitation, that's value creation.
No, I didn't look at it as a negative thing. I was
Yeah.
see
Okay.
weighing the pros and cons of how much the knowledgeable player remains to a game.
Yeah.
So that's the end of this.
So basically anytime, so what we can do with our games, for example, is we can blacklist players that are abusive. So anytime you violate terms and conditions we set, then we can blacklist so these assets cannot interact with our game engine, essentially. You can still have your assets, but you can't play our game. You can take it to Gods Unchained, though.
Maybe.
Let's try it.
I don't really have anything to add. We don't want your abusive players. Keep them.
I think, the only negative thing I can see here is, what we mentioned also in the beginning, what we've seen with a speculative, oh Jesus Christ, sorry, German, speculation part came into play, where people would just trade the assets, right? So it's really like a Wall Street type of engagement there, rather than actually playing the game. But we are moving. I see this absolutely moving away from that, because it's an environment where we have more and more better content, and people are in it for playing the game. And as you said, and if the kid in the basement then still can make now from all the hours of playing a buck out of it, that's even better.
I can add one thing to that. I think also it's important to remember that this is just a programming tool, right? There's all sorts of things you can build into your assets. They don't necessarily need to be tradable. For example, Gods Unchained cards are not currently tradable. And so there's all sorts of, the design space is very wide, right? And you can have assets that don't live on the blockchain, for example. So I think the way we see it is blockchain is just sort of a means of coordination between companies, right? If Dapper wants to launch assets, they can instantly have a liquid marketplace for that. They can be used in other games, all sorts of things. But you're not necessarily wedded to any sort of negative pieces of that, other than the challenges of usability. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, it's just another tool.
Yeah, so speaking about interoperability, what are the tools or standards that you feel would kind of make it easier for you as developers or marketplaces to kind of take interoperability a step further and make it easy for you to make your items interoperable? And as a follow-on to that, how, if at all, are you thinking about sort of residual value flows from your traveling items and the IP of that being in another environment but coming back somehow, some fraction of that value being traded coming back to you as or the creator and so on?
Yeah, I can talk about the standards piece of it. So I think right now, ERC 721 is almost like, or what it needs to become is kind of like the JPEG, right? Where cryptocurrency led to this native way to send money on the internet, right? Kind of like being able to send a file over email. Now you can send Ether from one address to another, or a near token. So similarly, I think ERC 721s are, they're sort of primitive, and those same primitive level of operations on them, sending one from one user to another, are still really early and hard to use. But over the course of last year, I think we made a lot of progress towards making it feel more like sending a JPEG from one person to another. So things that would help with that are, there's a lot of experimentation in terms of how to represent these things. So the idea of semi-fungible assets is kind of early on. The metadata for these assets is something that's they're typically centralized to some extent and not very standardized. So I think both of those areas would lead to a lot of improvements. For the second question, I think that's a tough one. I don't have a good answer. The one grain of salt I would add is I think there is a case to be made for these second layer games that build on top of existing things like CryptoKitties, adding enough value to the original game that there doesn't necessarily need to be programmatic incentives for the second layer game to capture some of that value, or the original game to capture that value. But there certainly could be interesting things you could play around with, sort of incentivizing the interoperability of these assets when they move to other environments. But I think it's possible that we won't need those.
Yeah, I think that's true. I just want to add quickly that CryptoKitties does have a secondary transaction fee. So any secondary transaction of a CryptoKitty, we earn revenue on. So that's something that at scale is meaningful. But I think more importantly, the secondary experiences should and hopefully bring more engagement and more, money moving through the original experience. So secondary experiences add value in that way.
One thing that we can all collaborate on is power, right? Like if you've got a level 10 something in Neon District, I mean, those are official partnerships. We all have to work like on the core game if we're going to recognize that power or not across universes. But something that's interesting that we saw with CryptoKitties, when these third-party developers took kitties that were not valuable, and then they built a whole game around it, and all of a sudden, these cats were super valuable on their marketplace, and they were like, "What's going on?" And we can see things like that. So it's something like that power distribution, sure, but maybe it's more creative to take assets that are undervalued and cheaper to accumulate for these developers and do something fun and interesting with them in other games.
Yeah, so touching on that last point, something which is possible is if you can find a market of a non-fungible token which you think is undervalued and then build an experience on top of that after you've hoarded the market, essentially, then you can be the price setter for that asset. One caveat I would probably say on the whole building digital experiences is that if you want to build a game, unless it's a very simple digital experience, which these will probably be built first and sort of explored quite thoroughly, you need to be very creative about how you do it, because often these experiences can be very expensive. So to create a video game, it can cost anywhere from $500,000 to $20, $30 million. So if you want to move past the sort of hobbyist developer level where you just have one person spending a bit of time to build an experience, then I do think that there will need to be some sort of incentive that can make it worth their while.
I don't really have anything to add. It was good.
Cool. Yeah, I guess we'll wrap it up if we don't have any more questions. Cool.